Today, we're going to give a 30-minute summary of the entire history of psychology. And if you ever find yourself in a conversation where someone drops names like Freud or Jung or even some modern psychologist you've never heard of, don't worry. After watching this video, you'll have a mental framework to make sense of it all. No matter what theory or psychologist comes up, you'll be able to place them in the larger story of psychology, so you'll never be caught off guard again. You're going to know the entire history of psychology, how to make sense of it, and where every major figure fits in. Now, I'll admit, psychology can be intimidating. People start throwing around terms like psychoanalysis, operant conditioning, or the collective unconscious, and you might feel totally lost. And let's be real, psychology is an evolving and complex field, and it's easy to feel like you're missing something. Now, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I'm constantly reading, and I still get nervous about whether I have my facts straight or not. Even after years of research or study, you might still feel unsure about the bigger picture. But there's a super simple way to make sense of it all. What's helped me and so many others is understanding psychology as a simple, unfolding story. And once you can see this story clearly, you'll be able to locate any theory or psychologist, no matter how obscure, right within that framework. Psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. And there are many branches of psychology which study the mind from different angles. But talking about all the different branches would be way too much and unnecessary to cover the most important aspects of the history of psychology. So instead of doing that, I want to highlight 7 concepts you need to know to understand the history of psychology. There are 7 constant tensions running through the history of psychology, which I want to highlight right now, so when they come up as we go through the story, you can place each person or theory in one or more of these contexts. 1. Nature versus nurture. Is our psychology more shaped by our genetic inheritance or by our environment and experiences? This is the age-old debate between nature, our biology, genes, and innate traits on the one hand, and nurture, the social and environmental factors we encounter on the other. For instance, are you more introverted because you were born that way or because of the way you were raised? Understanding this tension helps frame many psychological discussions on personality, intelligence, and behavior. 2. Individual versus collective psychology. How much focus should psychology place on the individual mind versus the social systems and groups that individuals exist in? Should behavior be understood mainly through individual traits, like personality and personal choices, or should the influence of culture, society, and group dynamics be given more weight? This tension helps to explain different approaches to understanding human behavior, from those that emphasize personal responsibility to those that consider societal pressures. 3. Determinism versus free will. Are we truly in control of our actions, or are we shaped by factors beyond our control? This tension explores whether human behavior is conditioned by external forces like our biology, upbringing, and environment, or if we have the ability to direct our own lives and make conscious choices. It's not just about whether free will actually exists, but rather whether psychology views people as determined by external conditions or as agents capable of influencing their own future. 4. Subjective experience versus observable behavior. Should psychology focus on what people experience internally, like thoughts and feelings, or should it prioritize what we can observe from the outside, like behavior? Now, this tension is crucial to the divide between approaches like psychoanalysis, which emphasizes internal experiences, and behaviorism, which focuses strictly on observable actions. It reflects a broader question. What should be the primary focus of psychological research? What's happening in the mind, or what's visible in behavior? 5. Conscious versus unconscious. How much of our thoughts, feelings, and actions are driven by unconscious mental processes that we aren't even aware of? This tension centers on whether psychology should study and focus on the unconscious mind, as Freud and Jung did, or concentrate on the conscious, rational aspects of human thought. It's about whether unseen forces in the mind play a significant role in shaping our actions, and how much of that can be scientifically studied. 6. Biological versus mental explanations. When we try to explain psychological phenomena, should we prioritize biological causes like brain chemistry and genetic inheritance, or focus on mental and cognitive processes like beliefs, emotions, and memories? This tension runs deep in modern psychology, especially as neuroscience has grown in influence. It asks whether the essence of human psychology can be found in the biology of the brain or in the intangible workings of the mind. Finally, number 7, deflationary versus inflationary views. How should we view the human mind and its potential? A deflationary view presents humans as driven by basic, often unconscious needs and impulses, emphasizing limits and constraints on human potential. In contrast, an inflationary view suggests that humans are capable of growth, self actualization, and transcending their limitations. Now, this tension often plays out between schools of thought like psychoanalysis, which takes a more deflationary stance, and positive psychology, which adopts an inflationary view by focusing on human potential and well being. Now, everything we discuss is going to fit into at least one of these tensions. Before psychology as we knew it ever existed, there was an ancient curiosity, an attempt to understand the mind that would later set the stage for the scientific discipline. In ancient Greece, the seeds of psychology were planted not just by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, but by lesser known thinkers like Alcmaeon of Croton, who dared to speculate that the brain was the source of thought itself. Alcmaeon was making an early contribution to the nature versus nurture debate here, highlighting the importance of our biological nature in the role of thought. Then we have Plato, who believed in a soul which directs our behavior, coming down on the side of nature being more important than nurture. Aristotle, on the other hand, was a big advocate of the tabula rasa, or blank slate, view of human psychology, coming down squarely on the side of nurture and laying the groundwork for the radical behaviorism which would emerge and dominate psychology in the early 20th century. But that was just the start of a story that would stretch across millennia. In 6th century China, Lin Ji conducted what might be the first psychological experiment, asking participants to draw a square with one hand and a circle with the other. Here we see an early attempt to understand observable behavior rather than focusing on just subjective experience. Meanwhile, in Persia, Ahmed ibn Sal al-Balkhi was exploring the mental side of things, how emotions like sadness and anxiety could distort the mind, and how changing one's thoughts could change their emotions. His ideas foreshadowed the later rise of cognitive psychology, with its belief in subjective experience as a central force in shaping our behavior. In the 17th century, René Descartes famously split the mind and body into two separate entities, suggesting that the mind controls the body in a clear declaration of free will, an idea that dominated thought for centuries, until behaviorists would later challenge it. Across time and place, we can see that the tensions in psychology were already building. Each of these moments, scattered across time and geography, was a crucial piece of a larger story that wouldn't come together until much later. With centuries of philosophical thought behind it, psychology as a science finally emerged in the late 19th century. One of the early figures was Gustav Fechner, a German physicist and philosopher. Fechner, along with Ernst Heinrich Weber, developed the Weber-Fechner law, which showed that psychology could be measured and studied scientifically. This was a huge step forward for the field. But if Fechner got the ball rolling, it was Wilhelm Wundt who truly put psychology on the map. In 1879, he opened the first experimental psychology lab, marking the formal birth of the field. Wundt was fascinated by the internal workings of the mind. He believed that by manipulating external stimuli, we could measure subjective experience and break it down into its core components. He was positioning psychology in the tension between the internal mind and external behavior, emphasizing the subjective over the observable. His approach, later developed into structuralism by his student Edward B. Titchener, sought to dissect mental processes into their smallest elements, a move that contrasted with the growing interest in holistic and functional approaches. But not everyone was convinced by this reductionist view. While structuralism was gaining traction, a new perspective was brewing across the Atlantic. In 1890, American psychologist William James published The Principles of Psychology, a work that would challenge the structuralist view head on. James didn't see human thought as something you could break into neat little parts. Instead, he introduced the idea of the stream of consciousness, that our thoughts are fluid and ever-changing, not static and dissectable. This pushed psychology toward focusing on the subjective experience in a more holistic way, suggesting that the mind is adaptable and dynamic. Now, this idea was revolutionary, as it suggested that the mind is fluid and adaptive, a notion that laid the groundwork for later developments in cognitive psychology, which focuses on how people process, store, and use information. James also founded functionalism, a theory that placed mental processes in the context of their purpose, how they help us survive and thrive. Functionalism stood in contrast to structuralism's analytical approach. James emphasized how mental activities serve an adaptive purpose, pulling psychology in the direction of evolutionary thinking and creating a tension between individual mental processes and their broader collective functions. Now, James didn't stop there. He also developed the James-Lange theory of emotion, which proposed that our emotions result from our physical responses to stimuli. In other words, we don't cry because we're sad because we cry. Now, this view placed James firmly in the biological camp, foreshadowing the rise of neuroscience and its quest to explain human behavior through biology. James's functionalism opened the door to new ways of thinking about psychology, ways that would influence cognitive, evolutionary, and even social psychology in the years to come. But the tension between subjective experience and observable behavior, individual versus collective psychology, and biological versus mental explanations would continue to shape the field as it moved further into the 20th century. 10 years after James' publication of the Principles of Psychology, psychology was shaken by a seismic shift when Austrian Jewish neurologist Sigmund Freud published his groundbreaking work, The Interpretation of Dreams. Now, Freud didn't just add to the existing psychological framework, he completely upended it. His radical ideas about the unconscious, wish fulfillment, repression, and human drives challenged the intellectual norms of the time. Freud's theory of the unconscious mind, where desires and memories repressed from conscious thought continue to shape behavior, was nothing short of revolutionary. It offered a new lens for understanding human thought and behavior. Freud put the debate of conscious versus unconscious mental life on the map, staking his claim firmly on the side of the unconscious. Freud went on to establish the school of psychoanalysis, training clinicians to explore patients' unconscious conflicts through techniques like free association. This marked the birth of modern psychotherapy, revolutionizing the treatment of mental illness. Freud argued that neurotic symptoms often stem from repressed sexual desires, or what he called the libido. According to his model, human psychology was a battleground between primal urges, on the one hand, the id, and societal constraints on the other, the superego, with the ego acting as the sort of mediator between the two. His psychoanalytic theory, with its emphasis on these internal conflicts, viewed humans as driven by raw, animalistic desires that civilization forces us to repress. Now, Freud's notion of sublimation, where pent-up psychic energy could be redirected into socially acceptable outlets, became central to his therapeutic approach. Freud's deflationary view of humanity, portraying us as creatures ruled by our unconscious and often dark urges, was deeply deterministic. Yet he also offered a remedy for our neuroses in the form of psychoanalysis. His view stripped modern man of the illusion of psychological free will, but also provided the tools to understand and cope with these hidden forces. Now, beyond academia, Freud's ideas penetrated deeply into pop culture, literature, and the arts. His explorations of the unconscious influenced everything from surrealist art to modern cinema, and his concepts like the Oedipus complex and Freudian slips became part of the cultural lexicon. Despite facing criticism and opposition, Freud's legacy as a pioneer of modern psychology endures, not only in the therapeutic realm, but also in the broader understanding of the human mind. Freud's growing influence attracted a circle of psychologists, some of whom would later break away from his ideas to forge their own paths. Alfred Adler was one such figure. Initially part of Freud's inner circle, Adler eventually disagreed with Freud's emphasis on repressed sexual and aggressive drives. Instead, he focused on social dynamics and introduced the concepts of the superiority and inferiority complex. While Freud emphasized nature and individual psychology, Adler swung the pendulum back toward nurture and collective psychology, highlighting the role of society and interpersonal relationships in shaping individual psychology. His break from Freud gave rise to his own school of thought, ironically named individual psychology. But perhaps Freud's most significant break came from his once close friend, Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Initially regarded as Freud's heir apparent, Jung's 1912 publication, Psychology of the Unconscious, marked the beginning of their intellectual split. While Freud viewed the unconscious as a repository of repressed desires, mostly tied to sexuality, Jung proposed something far more expansive: the collective unconscious. According to Jung, within every human being lies a reservoir of shared primordial images and archetypes, universal patterns of behavior and symbols found across cultures and time, reflected in mythology, religion, and even dreams. Jung took a strong stance here on the side of nature with his innate and universalistic archetypes. Where Freud viewed human beings as primarily driven by base, animalistic urges, Jung believed these impulses could also reflect deeper spiritual forces. Jung's view of the psyche was inflationary, seeking to restore a sense of meaning and spiritual depth to human existence, which Freud's deflationary perspective had stripped away. Freud's psychoanalysis aimed to manage unconscious drives, while Jung's analytical psychology sought to integrate them, a process he called individuation. This integration aimed at personal growth and the elevation of the human spirit, reintroducing a sense of free will into the realm of psychology. Jung saw individuals as capable of transcending their unconscious limitations, setting the stage for future developments in humanistic psychology. Although Jung never achieved Freud's level of mainstream success, his work has proved enduring, influencing everything from personality theory to dream analysis and comparative religion. His contributions to concepts like introversion and extroversion have led to popular acclaim through the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. His theory of the recognition and development of the opposite gender expressions within oneself, and his impact on art therapy, Jungian samplay therapy, and transpersonal psychotherapy cannot be overstated. His highly subjective approach, focusing on the internal, lived experience rather than strictly observable behavior, continues to resonate with those who see psychology as more than a hard science. While Freud's determinism sought to reduce man to his unconscious urges, Jung offered a counterpoint that empowered individuals to find meaning and direction within themselves. His legacy, though different from Freud's, continues to inspire a deeper, more spiritual understanding of the mind. While psychoanalysis captivated the world, another school of thought was quietly building momentum, one that dismissed the focus on the unconscious entirely. Unlike Freud's focus on the unconscious, behaviorism dismissed introspection entirely. American psychologist John B. Watson believed psychology should rely strictly on scientific experiments and observable behavior. He had no interest in exploring the mind from a first-person subjective perspective. For Watson, psychology began and ended with behavior. He famously declared, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and to train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." This blank slate view of human nature placed Watson squarely on the side of nurture. His controversial Little Albert experiment, where a young boy was conditioned to fear a white rat, showcased how emotional responses could be manipulated by external stimuli. Watson built upon Ivan Pavlov's earlier experiments with dogs, where neutral stimuli were paired with reflexive responses. Pavlov's work laid the groundwork for behaviorism, demonstrating that behavior could be conditioned through repeated associations. Enter B.F. Skinner. Skinner, an American psychologist, took behaviorism to its extreme and became the leading figure of radical behaviorism. His approach leaned heavily into the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate. For Skinner, behavior was shaped entirely by environmental stimuli and reinforcement, leaving no room for inherent qualities or instincts. His famous idea of operant conditioning, where behaviors are influenced by positive or negative reinforcements, cemented this view. Skinner believed that if you controlled the environment, you could mold behavior in any direction, making human psychology a product of purely external conditions. Now, this strict focus on behavior dismissed the conscious versus unconscious tension entirely. Unlike Freud, who explored unconscious drives, Skinner had no interest in what couldn't be directly observed. He saw observable behavior as the only valid domain for psychology, aligning fully with the belief that the subjective experience of the mind was irrelevant to scientific inquiry. In this way, Skinner's radical behaviorism opposed the human mind's inner workings as the seat of behavior and placed everything under the influence of external forces. In a broader sense, Skinner's work leaned toward determinism. He saw the individual as a machine responding to environmental inputs, a stark, deflationary view of human nature, reducing complex behaviors to simple, conditioned responses. This reductionist perspective created a sharp backlash, especially from humanistic psychologists who would later argue for the freedom and innate potential of individuals, restoring an inflationary view of the human spirit. Despite this controversy, Skinner's influence extended far beyond theory. His work laid the groundwork for therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, which uses principles of operant conditioning to modify behavior. His ideas of positive and negative reinforcement have had a massive impact on psychology and the treatment of mental illness. Though his approach dominated academic and experimental psychology for decades, Skinner's deflationary view of human nature as entirely shaped by external conditions was eventually largely countered by theories that sought to reintroduce the role of the mind and free will into the conversation. In response to the dominance of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, humanistic psychology emerged as a third force in psychology. Unlike behaviorism, which prioritized observable behavior and leaned toward determinism, or psychoanalysis, which delved into the unconscious at the expense of the conscious mind, humanistic psychology focused on the subjective experience of the individual. Here, free will reigned supreme, with psychologists like Carl Rogers championing the belief that humans are driven by an innate potential for growth, what he called self-actualization. Rogers saw human beings not as passive subjects to environmental forces or unconscious drives, but as active agents capable of change, bringing psychology back toward an inflationary view of human nature. Rogers' person-centered therapy became revolutionary for its emphasis on empathy, active listening, and creating a safe space for individuals to explore their inner worlds. Now, this method rejected the traditional authoritative therapist-patient dynamic and restored the idea that people could consciously shape their lives. However, Rogers didn't entirely dismiss the scientific study of behavior. He sought to balance objective measures with the deeply subjective and emotional realities of human experience. In his famous 1955 debate with B.F. Skinner, the stark contrast between Rogers' human-centered freedom and Skinner's environmental determinism became a microcosm of the ongoing struggle between different schools of psychological thought. Humanistic psychology was accompanied by existential psychology, which ventured even further into the exploration of freedom and meaning. Figures like Otto Rank and Viktor Frankl emphasized the existential questions of life, chiefly the need to find meaning amidst the inevitability of death. For Rank, creativity and the will to create were the antidotes to existential fear. Meanwhile, Frankl's logotherapy highlighted the human will to meaning, especially in suffering. His work underscored the importance of human freedom in the face of even the harshest conditions, such as those he personally experienced in Nazi concentration camps. Both Rank and Frankl were concerned with humanity's eternal tension between determinism and the free will to overcome it, emphasizing the individual's potential to create meaning even within the constraints of biological and environmental forces. Rollo May, one of the most prominent figures in existential psychology, expanded these ideas, bringing them into mainstream psychology. May focused on the anxiety that arises from our confrontation with freedom, isolation, and death. He argued that the modern world is filled with superficial distractions, whether through materialism, fleeting relationships, or the constant chase for momentary pleasures that keep us from confronting our existential realities. In contrast to humanistic psychology's often optimistic view, May acknowledged that the unconscious still plays a role in shaping our experiences, positioning him slightly more toward the deterministic side of the spectrum than someone like Carl Rogers. However, he believed that confronting our existential anxiety rather than avoiding it could open the path to personal growth, creativity, and authentic living. May's work was not simply clinical, it was philosophical, encouraging people to face their anxieties head on and use them as a source of strength. His insights into existential freedom provided a balance to the humanistic emphasis on self actualization, reminding us that personal growth often comes through confronting life's challenges, not just realizing our inherent potential. In doing so, May introduced a more complex view of human nature that integrated conscious decisions with the inescapable reality of biological and existential limits. May's work remains an invitation to reflect on how existential anxiety shapes our daily experiences. Rather than viewing it as something to fear, May believed this anxiety could fuel our greatest acts of courage and creativity. In recognizing this, he helped elevate psychology to focus not just on human suffering, but also on the possibility of transcending it. The other development in psychology which challenged the behaviorist paradigm was the cognitive revolution. It aimed to break the rigid boundaries of behaviorism, but instead of focusing on human emotion and meaning, it looked inward to understand mental processes themselves. The cognitive revolution began gaining traction in the mid 20th century as a response to the limits of behaviorism. One of the early challengers was American psychologist Edward Tolman, whose experiments with rats in mazes revealed something behaviorism couldn't explain, namely cognitive maps. Tolman showed that rats could navigate mazes using mental representations, even when not directly rewarded, suggesting that behavior wasn't just a product of stimulus response conditioning, but also of internal mental processes. Tolman's findings opened the door for psychology to re-embrace subjective experience while maintaining the rigor of scientific inquiry. This was one of the final nails in the coffin for full-on radical behaviorism. The experiments in early cognitive psychology showed that subjective experience is just as important, if not more so, for predicting human behavior and studying psychology. This revolution highlighted a significant shift in the nature versus nurture debate, emphasizing that mental processes, nature, interact with environmental stimuli, nurture, to shape behavior. Figures like George Miller, Noam Chomsky, and Ulrich Neisser expanded these ideas, focusing on cognitive structures such as memory, perception, and language acquisition. The cognitive revolution didn't just reject the extreme environmental determinism of behaviorism, but it also introduced new methodologies for studying the conscious mind without discarding the empirical rigor valued in scientific psychology. The cognitive revolution has also given us the theory of subconscious information processing, which posits that in order to maintain seamless cognition moment to moment, our minds have to filter out lots of irrelevant information. This has hardened the idea of unconscious mental processes into a genuine scientific hypothesis, and to some extent justified early psychodynamic thinkers like Freud and Jung and their focus on the unconscious. Now, fast forward to today, and the cognitive revolution's influence continues to ripple through modern fields. Cognitive psychology has laid the groundwork for advancements in brain research, including neuroimaging techniques that allow us to observe how mental processes actually unfold in real time. It's also played a crucial role in the development of artificial intelligence, as understanding how humans think and learn informs the design of machine learning algorithms and AI systems. Now, this ongoing research not only explores how the human mind functions, but also seeks to replicate or even enhance these processes in machines, making the study of cognition more relevant than ever. As psychology shifted from behaviorism and psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy emerged as a unifying force, combining the focus on observable behavior with subjective experience. Aaron Beck pioneered CBT by showing how distorted thoughts fuel psychological distress. This middle ground allowed therapists to address not just behavior, but the thinking behind it, transforming mental health care. Albert Bandura's social learning theory, with his famous Bobo doll experiment, further strengthened CBT, proving that behavior is shaped not just by what we do, but by what we see in others. Simultaneously, psychopharmacology revolutionized treatment, offering medication for conditions like depression and schizophrenia. Antidepressants and antipsychotics combined with therapy became the gold standard for comprehensive care, bridging the gap between the biological and psychological understanding of mental disorders. Social and developmental psychology added depth by exploring how we evolve over time and within our environments. Social psychology, brought to life by Kurt Lewin's work on group dynamics and Solomon Asch's conformity experiments, emphasize how we're shaped by our social context. Similarly, developmental psychology, from Piaget's stages of cognitive development to Erikson's psychosocial stages, mapped the unfolding of human growth from infancy to adulthood, demonstrating that our development is an intricate dance between biology and environment. Personality psychology furthered this by examining what makes each of us unique. Gordon Allport's trait theory laid the groundwork for understanding consistent personality traits, eventually leading to the Big Five model. This framework, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, became a reliable way to measure and study personality across cultures. Yet, even here, tensions between nature versus nurture, individual traits versus collective influences, and biological versus mental explanations continue to provoke debate. Speaking of biology, the integration of neuroscience with psychology showed us the brain's profound role in shaping who we are. Tools like fMRI and PET scans allowed us to see neural processes in action, but questions remain about how these biological functions correlate with our subjective experiences. Evolutionary psychology added another layer, positing that much of our behavior is rooted in ancient survival strategies. While it offers deterministic explanations, critics argue that culture and environment can't be ignored in shaping who we are. Cultural psychology, for its part, emphasizes the collective over the individual, revealing how our thoughts and behaviors are deeply shaped by the cultural systems we live in. This challenges the universality of many psychological principles, urging us to consider human diversity and the impact of social context on mental life. Systems psychology ties everything together by exploring how individual parts, whether in a person, family, or society, interact within larger dynamic systems. It recognizes that human psychology can't be isolated but must be understood in context, as we are constantly shaped by the systems around us, from our neural networks to social environments. Finally, positive psychology, inspired by humanistic thinkers like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, shifted the focus back to human potential, well-being, and meaning. It asked not just how to fix dysfunction, but how to thrive, exploring both individual fulfillment and social conditions that enable us to flourish. And there you have it, the sweeping journey of psychology from ancient philosophy to modern science. This is just the beginning, though. If you're curious to dive deeper into the mind, be sure to check out my video on Carl Jung's best books for more insight into one of psychology's most fascinating figures, or explore the intricacies of human behavior in The Fear of Being Alone. Subscribe, stay curious, and let's keep talking psychology.